It has often been said that life is like a tapestry that we weave from the decisions we make. For our next guest, her life so far is like a quilt. Let's hear about her journey, about how each distinct square in that quilt looks, and what she is planning now for her next one. I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Deb Clarke, who is Global Research Chair and Global Head of Investment Research at Mercer for close to 16 years, following an extensive career in asset management and consulting, which included 20 years as a portfolio manager. She's an active speaker on the conference circuit. She retired from her position at Mercer in June 2021 and is now building a portfolio career, which now includes an NED role on the EMEA board of Blackrock. She's also a member of the UK CFA Institute Advisory Board. She's been voted in the Financial News 100 Most Influential Women in Asset Management in 6 of the last 9 years. Welcome, Deb. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start with your background and how you ended up pursuing a role in the investment world. And did it take any surprising turns along the way?
Yes, I didn't get there in a straight line by any stretch of the imagination. I did a business studies degree, but I did it at a polytechnic with a thick sandwich year. So at the time, it was a year in which you worked. And I was fortunate enough to get a position in an insurance company close to home, where I was taken on for a year. The first 6 months was to be PA to the investment director. And I don't think I was a very good PA, but anyway, they bore with me. And then I did 6 months as a trainee analyst, which I thoroughly loved, analyzing companies and thinking about how companies can get into portfolios. And I was fortunate enough that at the end of that, they offered me a job after I'd finished my degree. So I went back, finished my business studies degree, and then came back and started my career with London & Manchester Assurance in Exeter, which is sort of outside of London. So it was perhaps a slightly different environment than being in central London as a fund manager.
And I'm particularly interested in how you thought about your progression from being a fund manager to a consultant and to the research function as well.
Yeah, so I was a fund manager or analyst and fund manager at London Manchester until the sort of late 90s when we got taken over and our roles moved to London, which we always knew they would do if anybody ever took us over. And I moved to London and did 3 years as a fund manager still and headed up global equities in the end. But I found the London environment much more challenging as a fund manager, and particularly it was about the time of the tech boom and then bust. So we were a growth manager. So 1 year we were heroes and the next year we were complete idiots because we couldn't manage portfolios. We were doing nothing different. It was just the style. And so when I got made redundant, which I think is in our industry is not unusual and gives you time to reflect, I took a few months off. And I actually thought, what do I actually enjoy doing? And how can I have a bigger impact on the industry than just being a fund manager? And what I realized was that as a fund manager, you only saw one small part of the picture. What you didn't see is that total holistic view of a portfolio that was helping an end client. So as a portfolio manager, I felt a long way away from the end client, whether it be helping a teacher or a fireman having a better and more dignified retirement. So I thought about consulting and I thought, well, perhaps this will fit my skill sets in terms of being able to engage with clients and that broader community. And so I made the switch initially to client work, which I enjoyed, but I really wanted to get onto the manager research side and actually see managers from the other side of the table, as opposed to being a fund manager and being questioned by the consultants. And that just really opened up, Mercer was a wonderful place to go and work and take on the global research that I used to do before my current role. And it was eye-opening because we could have access to all of these wonderful managers and engage with them and talk with them and understand their processes. So yeah, for me, it was an easier transition once I'd gone through the client bit to actually then move into research.
And in terms of career progression, did you actively seek out senior roles?
No, I didn't actively seek out senior roles. I was ambitious, don't get me wrong. And I remember when I left London & Manchester Assurance and one of the gentlemen who retired and didn't move up to London, and I said, Reg, I've always really liked working with you. And he said, yes, but you're an absolute pain in the backside. And I said, oh, thank you. And he said, no, not nastily, but you would always say, can I do this? Or can we look at it this way? Can we perhaps do it differently? And he said, you would always always in a really nice way. And he said, actually, I loved that because you never sat still and thought, okay, this is the status quo and we're not going to do things differently. So although I didn't seek out senior roles and promotions, I think I did it through actions and believed that I would get rewarded for it, which I believe I have been over time with that more senior progression. I think probably the current role I had in terms of Global Head of Investment Research is the one that I did specifically go for. And there were 2 or 3 of us interviewed for it. And I remember being offered the role and going outside and phoning my husband and saying, I'm actually not quite sure what I've taken on with this role. And he said, it's okay, a day at a time, you'll be fine. And we'll work through how this works. So I think it's a combination of both things, taking on bits of roles and then going for specific roles.
It's so interesting because it's true that I think senior people do appreciate the push and the stimulus, I think, that comes from having an eager, less senior person. And I suppose that's always a tricky one for junior people to understand, well, how much is too much and how much is a good element of, just I think, driving the organization forward.
I think people do appreciate, and I think it's how you ask as well. And it's how you say, I've observed this particular process. Have we ever thought about doing it in this way? Or please, could I do a project and look at it this way and see if I can come up with any improvements or efficiencies, or do it very proactively and very positively and not in a threatening way. That I think that's where people perhaps don't find it as easy to take that feedback.
And in looking at your career, did you ever have a mentor or a sponsor to guide you along the way?
I never had a mentor in the formal sense of, I think, as people perhaps do now. I had lots of people that it's a very bad term, but I used along the way. And I don't mean it in the sense that I used them and discarded them, but I was never afraid to ask people that I didn't understand something. Frankly, I've never been afraid to ask the dumb question if the dumb question needed asking. And I've always found people have been very receptive to helping. And so I tended to probably use people in terms of, here's the project I'm trying to work on, or here's a problem I'm trying to solve. I had a roster, if you like, of go-to people that I could actually use for different skills. I have always been very fortunate to have sponsors. And I think that comes about in terms of making sure that you have people that you can talk to about your career. One of my biggest frustrations with people is when they come to me and they say, well, we're resigning to go to X because we want to do Y. And I said, well, please, I wish you'd come and talk to me because you probably could do Y here. We could negotiate, we could find a way for you to help you do that. So I always was very open with a small handful of people as to what I wanted to do and how I was going to try and get there. And they became very good sponsors for me. So it was probably less formal than people think about mentors and sponsors now. But I have mentored people now in a more structured way. And I do enjoy that. And I love seeing people working out the problems for themselves or working out the answers for themselves if they've talked about the issues they're facing.
With any few pieces of advice that tend to come up time and time again with the people that you mentor, I know in a pre-discussion you mentioned encouraging women in particular to lean in to their roles.
Yes.
Do you find that you're giving the same pieces of advice, and what are they?
Yes, I am giving some of the same advice. So it's interesting because actually, as I mentor women, I sometimes feel that they're trying to be something they're not. So a good example was, I was mentoring one of our younger ladies in our team who's no longer with us, but she talked about wanting to learn to play golf. And I said, oh, great. Is that something you've wanted to do for a while? And she said, no, I feel I need to do that to get on in this industry. And I tried to work with her to say, actually, I think the important thing is to be yourself in this industry and to take the opportunities. And I said to her, well, I quilt and I craft. And she said, oh, but those are very female hobbies. I said, yes, because I'm female. And that's many of the managers that I speak to and interact with know that I do that. They send me interesting pictures from around the world sometimes. And so I think it is important that you lean in, but women have to sort of meet people, whoever they are, in a way that encourages discussion. So you might want to learn a little bit about football. So you can have a discussion about the World Cup at the moment. Some women may say, well, actually, why would I learn about something I'm not interested in? But it's to enable you to have a conversation. And if you start a conversation, it's amazing how much you will get back from the other person because you've shown a little bit of interest and you've leaned into what it is that they're interested in. And I think that holds true in the business world as well. Be inquisitive, lean in, try to understand how other people are thinking. And I would certainly say, if you don't get the response you expect, perhaps think about what's going on in their life. Put yourself in their shoes. Maybe there's something happened, and that's why you're not getting the response that you expect.
Very interesting. Well, we're going to get to your crafting a little bit later on, but let's stick with the day job for now. So talking about investment beliefs. So after such a long time in research and consulting, I'm sure you've developed some core beliefs. Maybe they've evolved over the years. Is there anything that you can share?
Yes, absolutely. I think they have. So when I first started, there was people find it strange. There was no technology, and so we used to sort of write the prices of bonds on a daily chart and chart some stock price movements. And I think there was a view that, we believed that good quality companies will in the long run outperform. And I still believe that basically, that good companies, well managed, that treat all of their stakeholders well, don't pollute the have a sustainable business model. That's probably always been at the core of what I believed. But over the years, actually, the importance of taking a long-term perspective has really become ingrained in me. And part of that is, as an individual, have got closer to retirement, one of the things I realize is that I'm actually not too concerned about the indices and what the indices do. I want to think that if I put $100 in towards my retirement, that it might become 102, 104 if I'm lucky, but I don't want it to become $80. So I'm much more in favor of having that long-term perspective, building genuine wealth creation to create better outcomes for our clients. That is my beliefs over the years. And it's very similar to Mercer's beliefs, that we believe there is value to have from that long-term perspective.
Very interesting. So definitely a focus more on the absolute performance versus a relative performance. Do you think the industry has become too bound up in relative performance? Does it stay that way?
I think that would be an interesting question. I mean, clearly a lot of money's gone into passive, which you can argue is, you're buying the index. And so I think it will be interesting as the industry evolves. And I believe there will be an evolution, as it's not so much now just about the returns you generate. It's about how you generate those returns. Are you doing it in a way that is sustainable both for you as a business, for the businesses that you invest in? Are you making sure that they are behaving in a sustainable way, and thinking about all the things such as climate change and D&I? So it's a much more holistic view about how the performance has been created that will be important. And as a result, I hope we get back to the situation where actually what we're all trying to do is create long-term real value, not necessarily following an index up and down on a yearly basis. But I think that's some way away yet, but we'll see.
And speaking of doing good, or at least letting your money be put to use in a meaningful way, now as you look at your portfolio career, if we think of the time spent thinking about investment as a pie, what share of the pie do you think sustainability, ESG, those type of issues will take?
I think they will increasingly take an ever bigger part of the pie, to the extent to which actually the pie is one and the same. So I've always believed at some point it will just be built into what we do, which is that we have why would you want to invest in a company that has bad governance? So good governance, the G should be there. Why do you want to invest in a company that has poor social, doesn't treat its stakeholders well? Again, why would you want to do that? So let's hope the S becomes the norm. And climate change is undoubtedly here. So there will have to be an eye on climate and the environment. And again, you wouldn't want to invest in a company that's going to pollute everywhere. So I think there's a definite journey to get there, but I'm hoping that in 10 years' time, we're not having the conversation about ESG or not, because it's actually all embedded within what we do. And that's actually the right way to invest.
And speaking of D&I, you've been in the investment industry for some time. You've, I'm sure, seen some developments, positive and negative, in terms of diversity. You've probably been in a minority in many rooms you've sat in, not being the only woman, I'm sure, in certain situations. What are your thoughts on the diversity of the industry? And I suppose how it needs to change? Would you give it a score on a scorecard? What would it be?
What would I give it? I think it's probably, if you take an A to C, it's probably a B, and looking to improve. I mean, things like the Diversity Project have been hugely beneficial for the industry. I think as an industry, we've done a really bad job of explaining what we do. So if I think about the world, the future of work and how people want to work, they want to go and work for companies that have a purpose. They want to go and work for companies where they feel they're, as you say, doing good in terms of what they're delivering. And I don't think as an industry, we've really understood how we can explain to people that you are making people's retirement more dignified and you're helping people retire in a better way. I think the industry, perhaps up until the time of COVID, was seen as a very insular, it's about me, it's about the individual. And that has definitely changed. I really hope that after COVID, we keep the fact that people can be more flexible. People can work at home, male or female, it doesn't matter. That actually we can all get our job done in a way that helps the business and also helps us as individuals. So I have seen a change, but it's glacial and it really does need to change more quickly. And I think that I personally am not a big fan of quotas, but I do understand that people have to be very, very intentional if they want to change things. And I think that goes right back to the recruitment processes, to who you engage with in terms of universities, to how you think about internships and bringing people in. You've got to build that pipeline. Because what we've seen is that the pipeline, I mean, certainly at Mercer, we recruited male and female graduates broadly equally for more than 10 years. But it's when they get into the middle levels, they're not retained. So we've got to do work on that retention. What is the culture that actually means women want to stay there and want to come back after they've had children and make it a thriving environment to work in? And I think Mercer's done a lot of work on that. I think some asset managers have, but I still think there's a lot of cultures that need to change so that women really feel welcomed into the workforce when they come back after having children. And it's not, there's no rolling of the eyes when they have to leave at 4:00 because they're going to log on later on and they can work flexibly. Diversity is getting there, but actually inclusion is now where you really need to make sure that we're doing the work to make sure people feel included so that the diversity recruitment you've got actually leads into long-term change and lasting change.
And I do think a big piece of that is role models, seeing senior women do the roles you might visualize yourself doing in 15 years, because then I think you can see yourself in it as opposed to not having a role model. And that's why I'm so sad we're losing you from the industry, but no, not quite, but in a sense, because, not quite, you have been a wonderful role model. Yeah. Which brings me to the next point of, the next chapter, the portfolio career. Mm-hmm. And obviously it's not your first time being in an NED role and being in an investment committee role, but what do you seek to bring to these roles and what value are you hoping to bring now in the next chapter?
Well, I'm hoping that what I can do in the NED role is really to bring the breadth of my experience to ask the right questions, to make sure that I'm going to Blackrock, as you say, on their EMEA board, but also that the industry as a whole, making sure that we are as an industry held to account to make sure we're delivering the right outcomes for our clients and to make sure we're doing that in a way that is really authentic. I think I've tried throughout all of my career to be authentic. I have a strong sense of sort of fairness and wanting to try and do the right thing. And I hope I've done that over time. I'm sure there's been times I've slightly gone off course, but I genuinely want to try and do the right thing for all of the people involved in my life. And that's really what I see myself bringing to the board, is to make sure that I'm asking the questions, that I want to make sure areas such as ESG and D&I are actually as part of the board discussions, because I think in the past it's been very much focused on risk or audit. But actually, I think a sustainability board is something that's actually going to increasingly become important on corporate boards, because actually it deserves that attention. It deserves that seniority attention, because if it doesn't have that, again, it's not going to be intentional and you're not going to get the outcomes you want.
Well, Blackrock is lucky to have you. So I look forward to seeing your impact there. But let's stay on the look back. So you've had a long career, a legendary one, I think. I'm sure there were some highs and lows in there. I think you've already touched on being made redundant, which I'm sure will feature. But maybe in your view, what were some of the highs and lows of that?
Yeah, I mean, being made redundant was tough. But actually, again, interestingly, I had somebody I could turn to who was able to talk me through, because I think as a fund manager, I thought, I've got no skills. I've been made redundant. What can I do? And he said, well, you talk to clients, you do analysis, you manage people. And so he suddenly unpicked the job into my skills. And that's actually a very useful, if you've got someone who can do that with you, it's very useful. Moving to London from Exeter was tough because we moved away from our family and we had a 5-year-old and we sort of yanked her away from everybody. But actually that turned out to be a good move in the end and everybody thrived up here. I think in terms of my highs, I worked in Chicago for 3 years from 2014 to 17. And that was great. Working abroad, again, I would highly recommend. Different culture, different people, and just an opportunity to see a different part of the world really on a day-to-day basis. So that was a really great opportunity that Mercer gave me to do. I mean, generally, I feel I've been fortunate to have lots of opportunities. I've always taken them. As I said, sometimes I've taken them and thought, oh, I'm not quite sure what I've done. But I would say to people, perhaps put yourself outside of your comfort zone sometimes. And you might feel, gosh, this feels a bit risky. And so could feel like a little bit of a low point. But often it will come through and be a high point for you if you take something different on.
Well, you certainly, I've got a kindred spirit there in loving Chicago. So I know we talked about that. In terms of just, again, these low points can be setbacks, can also be opportunities for lessons learned. Did you have any such setbacks that led you to learn lessons, maybe that you pass on to the people that you mentor now?
Yeah, I mean, there are things that I take from my investing days. And so I remember we were investing in tech stocks, as I say, through the tech bubble. And I remember we took a somewhat heroic position in a particular tech stock, which looking back with hindsight was the wrong risk position for that tech stock. But, sometimes with asset management or fund managers, you can't teach them not to make those same mistakes. The only thing you can do is try and contain the mistakes so it's not too big, because I believe people need to learn from their own mistakes and not necessarily from yours. You can obviously give them the advice you've done. I think in terms of other things that I've learned is, if I look back on myself, is to not sweat the small stuff. I was probably really bad at that when I started as an analyst. I used to get very, oh, this needs doing, and we haven't done that the right way, and we need to, and there's a little bit of me now which is just take things a little bit more calmly, just take a little bit more time. I've learned over the years that saying less is actually much more effective than saying more. And so the lessons I've learned really have come from, I think, just getting to know myself better and understanding, as I've taken on more in the way of leadership roles, understanding what works and what doesn't work for individuals. And it's very different. You need a different leadership style sometimes. As I say, I've tried to always be genuine and transparent as a leader, but some people need more help or more support than others. And it's just understanding how people work and trying to make sure you're there for people. So I'm not sure that fully answers the question, but it's, it's the lessons I've learned as I've gone through it. And it's probably about me as much as anybody.
I know, but you've mentioned the word authentic many times. And I think if that's a lesson to take, I suppose for the younger generation to learn, is that authenticity is something to be celebrated and actually really valued in a diverse corporate environment, as opposed to something that should be suppressed.
One of the important things is actually people being able to bring their whole self to work. And if you can't bring your whole self to work, you'll never be authentic, because you'll always... and I always thought that as a fund manager, you can't take something out of your head as you go into the office and be somebody different. You've actually got to be yourself, and whatever that may bring with it.
Well, speaking of authenticity, I'm going to move to what I've been looking forward to on this podcast, which is to ask you about your hobby, because I've never seen that on a LinkedIn profile, an avid crafts person. And I know we're going to look in a minute at some of your handiwork. Or probably that's too small a word for it. But tell me, how did this interest in crafts start? What age?
Well, even in my sort of early teens, I was a big crocheter. So I used to do a lot of crochet. And then I had one of my sister-in-laws was a big cross-stitch and quilter. And so she got me into cross-stitching and quilting in the early 90s. And all three of them I still do some of, but quilting has probably become my passion. So anybody who wants to take it up, I will warn you, it becomes very, very addictive. But it's very therapeutic. It's very different to what I do every day. I have a small sewing room where I have a sewing machine set up, and I'm probably one of the only people I know who perhaps uses my sewing machine 3 or 4 or 5 times a week. But I find it therapeutic. I have to think about what I'm going to make. I have to cut up a piece of material, and I have to sew it back together again, which my husband always finds strange. And then either I quilt it, or I do actually send some of them to a quilter to have them done. And actually, while I've been at Mercer, I've generally, for all of the females on my team who've had babies, I've tried to make them all a small baby quilt. So there's a few baby quilts floating around from people who've had children on the team. Well,
we've spoken on this podcast a bit about affinity groups, and I know there are some massive quilting affinity groups. I'm not sure, have you raised to that standard that you like to hang out with other quilters?
I haven't raised to that standard, but we do have a city craft group, which has got a number of people from the city here in London. So we used to meet in a pub, which was great, and have a drink, and most of them are actually crocheters, but we've actually transitioned to online. But we do get together, and there's probably 6 people in the core group with a few others. So I think there's quite a few people in the city who have other hobbies, and I think it's nice to do something that is different from the day-to-day, to be able to switch off. And I think that's the biggest challenge in our industry, particularly after COVID, is that whole mental well-being. And so if you can have something that you're passionate about in a different walk of life, I think that's helpful.
Well, you said you would show us here on the video some of your work. So please show us.
I thought I'd show you this one.
We've got a very modern blue quilt. I'm not sure this is for the people on audio only, with some very dramatic graphic stripes. Absolutely.
That was one of the first ones I made.
How long did that take you, Deb? What kind of
I don't ever count it because I can never work it out. But I wanted to show you this one because this is a slight trend of making material out of old material. So if you can see, this is scraps of material, making them into sort of new blocks.
Beautiful.
And that's another trend at the moment. And I've just got one more I'd like to show you.
So a very sustainable example there of the circular economy in action, that the quilt is a sustainable quilt. Beautiful.
And this one is another one. So this has actually got some material from my best friend from when she had her baby in 1994. It's got some shirt material from Gareth Anderson, who's on our London team. And there's various other people who've donated shirts to me there. So it's another ability to recycle, if you like. So
that looks like that should be taking pride in place, hung up on some office lobby somewhere. That was a beautiful example. I think you sell yourself short. You have most definitely risen to the standard of the Quilters Congress. So thank you very much for sharing that. And I'm definitely going to hope that our listeners will switch on to a little bit of video that I'll show with that, just so they capture that. And we'll post a picture, a still from that as well. But let's just go back to a few closing questions. And I wanted to ask you about any key people that have been influential. You mentioned mentors and sponsors, but maybe throughout your life, who supported you through some of the career transitions?
Yeah, so I was very influenced by mum. My mum worked full time, and she was a huge part of my push to go to university. So I was the first in our family to go to university, but she was very keen for me to go to university, and she was very supportive of me doing so. I then had actually one person who, when we moved from Exeter to London, took me under his wing. And what I really liked about him was we would go and do a presentation together, and he'd come back to the office and we'd say, let's go and have a cup of coffee. Let's go through the presentation. How can you improve? And he'd say things such as, well, we didn't do very well with this slide. Perhaps we can do something better. And actually, you did very well with that slide. And it taught me that actually people like good feedback and constructive feedback, but in a way that doesn't personalize it to them. So he was called Greg Richmond, and he went on to do many other things in terms of coaching. And he was just a really good coach, and he took the time. And so I've always tried to emulate him in terms of other people when I try and help them. And then as I've gone through, I mean, the one person probably who's been hugely supportive is my husband. Without him, I wouldn't be able to do that. He has been very supportive through this time, and is a great sounding board when I have issues. And I think having somebody who can be that sounding board and able to just take a dispassionate view, he doesn't know often the situations, and so he can actually just have that very different perspective. And so I would say those have been the people who've helped me through when I've needed them. And generally, I have a very good set of broad friends in many different walks of life. And I think that's one of the things. I'm not wedded to the financial world. I have lots of friends who do other things as well. And I think having a slightly different perspective on life. My brother is a lorry driver, and that's, gives you a different perspective, working for things like Amazon and getting a different perspective on life. So yeah, I would say there's not been any one person, but I've had lots of people who really supported me over the years.
And just on the feedback point, because this is something I often struggle with, is how do you manage when you're giving feedback with the best intentions and it's not landing well, it's getting a defensive response?
I often think if it's getting a defensive response, you probably need to stop the conversation and then start it again. Because I think if you get into that defensive response, the person is not listening. The person's not listening to the feedback. They're just responding in that way because actually they just don't want to listen. So there's two things I would say is, one, always try and give timely feedback. So I had a situation a number of years ago where I had to give some feedback, and somebody was going on 3 weeks holiday. And I remember I did talk to my husband about this. I said, look, I don't know if I want to give her this feedback or before she comes. And when she comes back, he said, when she comes back, it's too late. You might not want to do it now, but actually it was about some behavior. You should do that feedback now. And I did it, and actually behavior changed and it was fine. But if somebody's not really being responsive, I think you need to look for good examples when you can say to them, do you remember we talked the other day about X and you got defensive? Actually, I've just observed it with you doing exactly the same thing with wherever it may be. So perhaps we can now talk about how I can work with you to make this better. So again, it's not giving feedback that just says that's not good. It's actually saying, I've observed this. How can I work with you to make this better? Because you don't want to just give negative feedback or bad feedback. You want to actually make sure somebody's going to improve as a result of that, or, in themselves improve.
Some really good actionable advice there. So thank you. And staying on advice, was there any key advice that you received or any creed or motto that you live by in your life?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of the time that I've had feedback from people has always been around, take the opportunities that come. Don't be afraid. There's enough people around to help support you. So always take the opportunities that come. So I am a taker of opportunities. Always be kind to people. I know that sounds soft in some ways, but actually our industry, you don't need to be rude to anybody. There's no need to, be polite, be kind, have time for people. And I think that's what I've always lived by is we're all equal. None of us are different. I might have a senior role, but I love our, in Mercer, the people at the desk, the security guards outside. I love the security guards outside. They'd always say hello, Deb, and we are all equal in this. And if you don't respect everybody, then you can't expect that respect from other people. So I've always tried to live by, I am no different to anybody else. As I'm fortunate to be in the position I'm in, and I have a degree of leadership and I need to make decisions, but I can do it in a way that is human and kind and all the right way to do things. So I suppose it's the right way to behave as well.
And given what you know now, is there any advice you would give to your younger self?
Mm-hmm. Oh, gosh. It's interesting. I don't often look back and think, oh, I wish I'd done something different, because I'm a great believer that I've made the decisions with the information I had at the time. One thing my husband and I talk about is whether or not it would have been interesting to have moved to London before we did, but we didn't. I'd worked for 15 years down there before I moved to London. I would probably, the only advice I'd give to myself is perhaps to really not sweat the small stuff and to not get caught up in things that you can't change. Things happen. Forgive and forget, because you do need to move on. Tomorrow's another day, and you just need to make that day count. We don't know how long we're here, so make each day count. And I think perhaps when I was younger, my younger self would have got too tied up in things that didn't matter.
Well, thank you so much, Deb. I used the quote before, life is a tapestry woven by the decisions we make. And if I think of your life, not as a tapestry, but as a quilt, I think each square is unique and has its own rich history, and it might look different from the next, but you have sewn it together in a way that makes it really quite a work of art. So thank you so much for coming here.
Thank you.
And for sharing your insights with us. It's been a pleasure.
Lovely. Thank you very much for having me.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their stories, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.